What happens when a lone rider falls into a ravine with his horse, and an Apache matriarch takes him in to train their young? Witness this unbelievable true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The year was 1867, and the Arizona Territory stretched out like an endless ocean of red rock and scorched earth. Samuel Crawford, a former Union cavalry scout, rode his sorrel mare through the narrow canyon passes, searching for a new beginning far from the blood-soaked battlefields of the Civil War. The war had ended 2 years prior, but the screams of dying men still echoed in his dreams. He sought solitude in the wilderness, a place where he could forget what he had become. Samuel had heard the warnings in the last settlement. The Apache controlled these lands, and white men who wandered too far often never returned. But he was too weary to care about danger, too haunted to fear death. His horse picked her way carefully along the rocky trail as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. The canteen at his hip was nearly empty, and his supplies were running low. Then it happened in an instant. The mare's hoof caught on loose shale, and the earth seemed to crumble beneath them. Samuel felt the sickening sensation of falling as horse and rider tumbled into a hidden ravine. They crashed through brush and bounced off rock faces, falling what seemed like an eternity before hitting the canyon floor with bone-jarring force. When Samuel opened his eyes, the sky above was a narrow ribbon of fading blue between towering walls of stone. Every part of his body screamed in agony. His left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. A few feet away, his mare lay motionless, her neck bent in a way that told him she hadn't survived the fall. Tears streamed down his dust-covered face, not from his own pain but from the loss of his faithful companion. He tried to move but collapsed back onto the rocky ground. Dehydration, blood loss, and shock were claiming him. As darkness crept into the edges of his vision, Samuel accepted that this ravine would be his grave. Then he heard voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand. 3 figures appeared above him, silhouetted against the darkening sky. 2 were young Apache warriors, their faces painted and their eyes cautious. But it was the third figure that captured Samuel's fading attention. An elderly woman stepped forward, her weathered face marked with the wisdom of countless seasons. Her silver-streaked hair was bound in traditional fashion, and she wore deerskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. This was Grandmother Nalin, though Samuel wouldn't learn her name until later. She was the matriarch of her band, a woman whose counsel was sought by chiefs and whose knowledge of healing was legendary among her people. She studied Samuel with sharp, intelligent eyes, then spoke rapidly to the young warriors. They hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with helping a white man, but they obeyed her without question. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness as they rigged a travois and carefully moved him. The journey was agony, but eventually, he found himself inside a wickiup, a traditional Apache dwelling made of brush and hides. For days, he burned with fever while Grandmother Nalin tended his wounds. She set his broken leg with practiced hands, applied poultices made from desert plants, and forced bitter teas down his throat. During his delirium, Samuel sometimes thought he was back in the war, sometimes believed his mother was caring for him, and sometimes understood exactly where he was and expected to be killed at any moment. But each time he woke, Grandmother Nalin was there, her presence steady and calming. As weeks passed and Samuel's strength slowly returned, he began to understand the unusual situation. Grandmother Nalin hadn't saved him out of charity alone. She had a purpose for him. The young warriors of her band needed training in new ways. The Apache had been fighting for their homeland for generations, but the world was changing. The white soldiers were better armed, more numerous, and relentless. Through gestures, broken Spanish that they both understood a little, and slowly learned words of each other's languages, Grandmother Nalin made her proposition clear. Samuel would teach the young warriors about cavalry tactics, military strategy, and the white man's ways of warfare. In return, they would teach him to survive in the desert, to move like a shadow, and to read the land as they did. Samuel was conflicted. He had no love for war anymore, yet he understood her logic. These people were fighting for their homes, their way of life. They reminded him of why he had once believed the Union cause was just. And practically speaking, he had little choice. He was hundreds of miles from any settlement, still recovering, and completely dependent on their mercy. The training began slowly. Samuel sat propped against rocks while young warriors gathered around him. Through demonstration and careful explanation, he showed them how cavalry units moved, how to predict soldier movements, and how to identify weaknesses in military formations. He taught them about supply lines and how disrupting them could be more effective than direct combat. In return, the young Apache taught him their skills. They showed him how to find water in seemingly barren land, how to move across rocky terrain without leaving tracks, and how to read signs in nature that warned of approaching danger. They taught him their language, their customs, and gradually, they taught him to see the desert not as a hostile wasteland but as a provider for those who understood her rhythms. Grandmother Nalin watched it all with satisfaction. She would sit near the training sessions, working on beadwork or preparing food, but Samuel knew she missed nothing. Sometimes she would interject with a comment or a question that showed her strategic mind was sharper than many military commanders he had known. Months turned into a full year. Samuel's leg healed, though he would always walk with a slight limp. His skin bronzed under the desert sun, and his body adapted to the harsh environment. The young warriors who had once looked at him with suspicion now treated him with respect. He had proven his knowledge was valuable, and more importantly, he had proven he could be trusted. But tensions in the territory were rising. More soldiers were arriving, more settlers were pushing into Apache lands, and violence was escalating on both sides. Samuel knew his time with the band was coming to an end. He had become too much of a liability. If soldiers found him living with the Apache, it would bring severe retaliation upon the band. One evening, Grandmother Nalin called Samuel to her fire. Through their now comfortable mix of Apache, Spanish, and English, she told him it was time for him to go. She had arranged for 2 warriors to guide him to the edge of the territory. Her eyes, ancient and knowing, held both sadness and certainty. Samuel protested. These people had become his family, this life had given him purpose again. But Grandmother Nalin was firm. She had saved him for a reason, and that purpose was fulfilled. The young warriors were better prepared now, and Samuel needed to return to his world before his presence brought danger to hers. On his last morning, the entire band gathered. Warriors he had trained clasped his forearm in respect. Children, he had told stories to hug his legs. And Grandmother Nalin placed her weathered hand on his chest, speaking words he understood meant that he would carry a piece of their world with him always. The guides took him to a settlement 3 days' journey away. As Samuel watched them disappear back into the desert landscape, he knew he had been forever changed. He had fallen into that ravine as a broken man fleeing his past. He emerged as someone who had been given a rare gift, the chance to see the humanity in people he had been taught to fear, and to learn that wisdom and honor existed in all cultures. Samuel Crawford never spoke publicly about his time with the Apache. In that era, such a story would have brought suspicion and danger to all involved. But in the years that followed, he became known as a man who advocated for fair treatment of native peoples, who spoke against the violence and broken treaties, and who lived with a quiet dignity that suggested he had learned profound lessons somewhere in the wild places of the Arizona Territory. If you enjoyed this incredible story from history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Whisper of the Past for more untold tales from America's frontier. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. Until next time, keep listening to the Whispers of History.